Hi, English 2205. I think that's who we are. American Lit. This is our week 2 video. This week we will primarily be focusing on the work of Walt Whitman, Song of Myself. And there's a few things I want to say about the best way to engage with the material, as well as why we're reading it, why things are structured this way. I found it actually pretty overwhelming to come up with a week-long unit that gives a sufficient overview and introduction to Walt Whitman. Ideally, that's the stuff of, well, in my experience, a lifetime. Weeks, months. We have 1 week, though, and we have to study Whitman, because without looking at Whitman, we are not setting ourselves up to understand the rest of American literature that comes after. He's really that formative and really that significant in helping to distinguish the American voice in literature. Also, I love his work even while it troubles and stymies me. I cannot say I get Whitman in the way I do feel like I get some other writers, but that's part of the pleasure, where I think I first had to read aspects of Leaves of Grass probably in high school, perhaps like some of you, and felt like it was a chore, like I was being tricked. I kept being like, okay, but what is the metaphor of the grass? And that's absolutely the wrong way to read not only Whitman's work, but really any work of literature. Most of us have been trained to read it like it's a set of symbols, and we have to then decode it, and then all of a sudden the meaning will reveal itself. And if we don't immediately understand it, then we aren't good at it and don't get it. And that's just absolutely not the way that writers write. So it's not the way I encourage you to read. Instead, keep your eyes and ears and heart and brain open and start to talk about and think about the first things that kind of resonate with you, even if you don't know why. Asking questions is always the best way to start. So I encourage you, as you're going through the text, underline, star, exclamation point, question mark, anything that's intriguing, any language that is fresh, any image that seems compelling. Don't worry about looking for right answers. That's not where we start out. We will have discussions about how it all connects, but first you have to give it a good read before you can start to look for how to structure a response to a question that a professor might ask. So that's one way I want to encourage you to engage with the text. The other is that his work is really made to be experienced not just with the mind. It's made to be experienced with your emotions, with your hearts, and with the body. It is a poem about the body, but also of the body. That's why there's so many vocal inflections. The range is incredible. He hits sounds from all over English language and borrows some from other languages. It's incredibly tonal. So I invite you, one, to either read it out loud. I often enjoy doing that. I mean, sounding perhaps like a bit of a crazy person. Maybe I might have yelled a Carl Sandburg poem in Chicago one night, it's named Chicago, and I was doing it, and then someone came up and started doing it with me, and it was one of the most amazing moments of my life. You don't have to do that. You can read it out loud yourself. It's a great way to aid in comprehension, but you can also listen to recordings of it. There are plenty available online. I haven't found someone whose voice I loved enough to do the whole thing, but you are more than welcome to do that. I also set up a link to a project called Whitman, Alabama. That's an incredible documentary project where, and I describe it in the link, but a documentary filmmaker asked residents, Alabamans, to recite a section of Whitman's work. And in this way, I think really embodies the nature and the spirit of Song of Myself, in that it is made to live in all kinds of bodies, and that there is no kind of body that is not invited into his embrace, into his intellectual and emotional and physical embrace. And it's incredibly important. We'll talk a lot about the time period in which he wrote and why that was so radical, but honestly, why that remains radical today. That people essentially are shamed and limited and discriminated against because of the bodies they live in. And Whitman decries all of that. He says, and also that not that we should ignore bodies. Never does he say, what does it matter what body we're in? Let's just connect up here. And he's like, no, we are in bodies. Let us celebrate that. I sing myself and celebrate myself, and the self is in a body. It is not just the soul. He says this, it's not worth ameliorating difference. It's not worth overlooking, saying like, aren't we just all the same inside? Saying, no, we are all very different, and yet we are one. So I'll talk a little bit more about his project in a minute, but obviously I get really excited when thinking about his project, and seeing it performed in that way by so many different kinds of people is incredibly powerful. So, and the other thing I want to say about it is that I will also indicate certain parts to emphasize. I encourage you to read the whole thing. I realize that might not be realistic, so that's why I've indicated which sections to do. Make sure that you look at. But like take 10 sections, which is a few pages a day, and you'll be fine. So why do we read Whitman? I'm going to talk a little bit about that by talking about what came before Whitman. And I'm going to read you a poem. So I'm going to be going around in my apps on the computer, and I will have a spaced out look on my face. It's because I'm reading something. The Children's Hour. Between the dark and the daylight, when the night is beginning to lower, comes a pause in the day's occupations that is known as the children's hour. I hear in the chamber above me the patter of little feet, the sound of a door that is opened, and voices soft and sweet. From my study I see in the lamplight, descending the broad hall stair, grave Alice and laughing Allegra and Edith with the golden hair. A whisper and then a silence, yet I know by their merry eyes they are plotting and planning together to take me by surprise. A sudden rush from the stairway, a sudden raid from the hall. By 3 doors left unguarded, they enter my castle wall. They climb up in my turret, over the arms and back of my chair. If I try to escape, they surround me. They seem to be everywhere. They almost devour me with kisses, till their arms about me entwine, till I think of the Bishop of Bingen in his mouse tower on the Rhine. Do you think, O blue-eyed banditti, because you have scaled the wall, such an old mustache as I am is not a match for you all? I have you fast in my fortress, and will not let you depart, but put you down into the dungeon in the round tower of my heart. And there I will keep you forever, yes, forever and a day, till the walls shall crumble to ruin and molder in dust away. So that's a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow called The Children's Hour. You have probably heard of his name, or you went to an elementary school named after him. He was the most famous American poet during his lifetime, which since he died in, I believe, the 1880s, also encompassed Walt Whitman's lifetime. He's still well known, although his fame has been overshadowed because his impact was on our literature was overshadowed by Whitman's impact. I chose that poem because I actually like it. I could have chosen a million, it feels like a million Longfellow poems that I don't care for. But you'll notice they followed a pretty exact rhythm. It messed with it in a few places. A whisper, then a silence. Yet I know by their merry eyes. So you get this like rhythm. The poem's in quatrains, which is 4-line stanzas of each. It's an A-B rhyme, meaning that the first and third lines of the stanzas rhyme, and the second and fourth lines of the stanzas rhyme. So it's very, it's in a given form. And Longfellow was writing a tradition of English poetry that had gone back at that point. We're talking 400 years-ish. It's, and he, as an American, was playing with it a little bit, but not in the way that Whitman would. So I wanted you to hear that kind of approach toward a poem versus Whitman's. And we'll just go to I won't read the whole thing, but we'll just go to part 1, which, because I only have vaguely memorized, I'll read. Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood formed from this soil, this air, born here, of parents born here, from parents the same and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old in perfect health, begin, hoping to cease not till death. Creeds and schools in abeyance. Retiring back a while sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard. Nature without check, with original energy. So, one, when you come to the end of a section, don't go, well, okay, what does it mean? Wrong question. First, just go with what you notice. One is we see irregular rhythms in his work, different line endings, super long lines, super short lines, no structured repeating stanza format. There is rhythm in it though. Just listen to the first few lines. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. We get that iambic. Iams are da 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 da. So we get that. So what we see in Whitman is the product of someone who had read extensively. He was in his late 30s when he began this project and would work on it for his entire life, constantly revising, going back. So by that point, he had read extensively English language, poetry, and literature. So in order for him, and this is true of most artists, when you break things open, it's because you've learned a lot about it. You've studied music or you've studied art, you've studied literature, whatever the genre is that you're working in order to blast it into something new. And that's what we see Whitman do here. So, one, on just a free verse level, it's revolutionary, right? That he ignores so many of the things that came before about what makes a poem. He's like, or I do this. And lots of people were like, oh, heavens no. However, they talked then. But that's part of the project, right? How do you engage a readership that thinks they know what they're about to read? That's one way of creating the sort of suspense and attention. The other thing that what Whitman does is really remarkable is his use of vernacular and lots of high and low dictions. So he uses speech from all different kinds of Americans. He uses slang. He will mimic syntactical patterns after different regions, different groups. And at this time in America, of course, you're going to have pretty significant regional dialect differences that we don't see anymore because of it's been ameliorated by access to television, movies, now the internet, things like that, where people have the standard American accent, and that some of us might have a regional accent, but not in the way that at Whitman's time that would have been true. But he borrows from all of this. He takes from, you see a lot, if you've already started reading, you'll see a lot about railways and shipbuilders, stevedores, and he takes it all and he puts it in there of the working man, the educated, and different groups, non-European Americans, and he puts it all in there and he creates a new way of talking. This is going to be familiar to some of you if you are fans of rap. Rap is an incredibly American art genre. One, it draws, of course, from African-American song traditions that go back to Africa and that took shape and took root during the years of enslavement. But of course, not only. But I liken Whitman to rap in this idea that it borrows from everything and is in that way endlessly thirsty and hungry for knowledge, right? That's what makes it a really exciting format for me. And so I think that if you can think of Whitman like that, that can really help aid in your understanding. Like, well, he was just talking about this. Why is he not talking about this? I don't know, because he knew both of those things. Because both of those things are American. And part of what he's doing in choosing to embody and embrace all of these different vernacular, all these different dictions, is in literature, he is essentially enacting democracy, or at least the ideal of democracy. Throughout his project, he is pushing us to embrace those not like ourselves. If we are white, to embrace people who were either here first or brought here against their will, and to face that. Men and women, gay and straight. he brings everybody in. He refuses to draw delineations. I'm looking through my book a little bit. In section 24, he says, I speak the password primeval. I give the sign of democracy. By God, I will accept nothing which all cannot have their counterpart of on the same terms. It says, I won't take anything from this area, this life, if everyone can't have the same. What is good belongs to me, or what belongs to me is good belongs to you. He refuses to draw these distinctions, even while his use of the I is interesting, because at sometimes when he says I, he does mean I, Walt Whitman, doing this thing, lying in this grass, touching this person, thinking these thoughts. But he also means all of us, that we are linked in our humanity, and that we are all deserving of dignity. Now think about that even has to be said, and that it was controversial. And it's controversial now. We excuse all kinds of behaviors because of difference, perceived difference, nationality, gender, sexuality, race, ability. And he refuses that. He says, any action against you is an act against me, and vice versa. Every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. That is powerful. That you feel that in your body. You either know that truth or you don't know that truth. And he has this relentlessly and hopeful democratic project. But let's talk about the controversy a little bit. It's not just in the line lengths and the refusal of form. It's some of the content is highly sexual. Because if you're going, according to Whitman, in Whitman-esque ideals, it's that, well, we're sexual creatures. We live in bodies. They have desires. They want things. They enjoy being touched. They enjoy laying naked in the sun. Well, not me so much. Pretty fair. I gotta have an umbrella or something. But you get that he's saying that we do not experience the world except through our senses. The only way we know anything is because we have perceived it through our bodies. There is no poetry without the body. There is no democracy without the body. There is no religion without the body. We only know what we know because we saw it, we smelled it, we tasted it, we touched it. What's the other one? Felt it. Heard it. I'm forgetting one. But you see, I have 6 senses, so I get a little lost sometimes. This idea that we can't be separated from the bodies we were born into. What a foolish project, according to Whitman. So rather than ignore that, embrace it, celebrate it. And now Whitman pushes the line even for a modern reader sometimes. Like, is he talking about what I think he's talking about? And a lot of times, if we're reading older texts, I'll say, oh, no, that's actually just, you're using a modern understanding. But in Whitman, yeah, he's totally talking about the thing you think he's talking about. And sometimes we have trouble realizing that, old-timey people had desires. And yes, they did. They were just given much less freedom to understand that, especially if you were a woman or you were gay, as Whitman was. And so part of his project is perhaps this desire to not see himself as other. He doesn't ever present himself as outsider or other because of who he was born loving. He is everyone else. He is like everyone else because he is everyone else. What a mind-blowing way to perceive the world. And so these are some of the reasons that we look to Whitman as our grandfather, as the grandfather really of American literature. His project with free verse and those kind of long lines and this flowing wouldn't really be fully realized or pushed to a new level for about 100 years. Allen Ginsberg, in his epic poem Howl, does something really similar, but he's putting it in a different context. And pushing against the mores of his time in the way Whitman was pushing up against the mores of his. But he's also a poet of such beauty and reflection on nature. He's all these things. Is he vulgar? Yes. Uh, is he florid? Yes. Is it transcendent? Yes. Is it in the body? Yes. Part of all of this project comes from his reading of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, The Poet, and this call. And I'm going to read some of that because I think it can be really helpful. I put this essay up for you guys. Sorry. Caffeinate. And it's pretty long, so I will read you an excerpt. So Emerson was calling for an American style of writing, and also for the poet as a seeker of truth and to occupy a certain role, I don't want to say a noble role, but a needed role in our society. The sign and credentials of the poet are that he announces that which no man foretold. He is the true and only doctor. He knows and tells. He is the only teller of news, for he was present and privy to the appearance which he describes. He is a beholder of ideas and an utterer of the necessary and causal. For we do not speak now of men of poetic talents or of industry and skill in meter, but of the true poet. So for him, it's this idea of the true poet as being someone who observes and perceives past where the rest of us are either able to or comfortable with doing, and then tells us about it. And I absolutely also, even today, I try to hold with that. Most poets I know do. And Whitman, though, took it like a call to arms. And because he was a little bit older and had been tinkering, or he called simmering, that this whole time he'd been like waiting for something. And then it came and he read Emerson. He's like, well, here I go, right? And he brings in, the style is due in part to oratory traditions in American culture that aren't just the European, but also Native and African as well. And these traditions, because it's interesting, because at least my opinion is that American literature before 1865 was, I don't know. Some of it's pretty rough. There's some highlights, but the best work that came out of that period, I think, is its oral work and its the political essays. And some of those are actually beautiful. And he's borrowing from all of that. Like, people used to go and hear speakers speak for like 2 hours, 3 hours. Like, what are you going to do? Oh, we're going to the hall and this guy's going to talk. I mean, there's, what else are you going to do? Could play, like that stick and wheel game. But so this oral tradition in America was so strong. And also, because you have such a range of classes, America is a nation of immigrants, the literacy level wasn't going to be super high at that point. Of course, not as high as now. And so the oratory tradition in part took off because of that. It's more complicated, but I'm doing a general summary. So he's pulling from all of these things. And he really, I think, is looking at the heart of what it is to be American. And when I say American, I'm talking about the United States. Because people who live in the rest of the Americas are American as well. It's problematic that we don't have another term, but we don't have another term. So that's what I mean. But he's looking at this idea of what it is to be American. And he does so by, one, acknowledging our prejudices. Again, the fact that he has to even be like, hey, you know what? Women are okay too. Men and women, lets us know that there was, deep-seated prejudice and bias against women, at least, who tried to break out of any of those pre-given forms. And so he's speaking essentially to our greatest ideals. I'm going to read to you a little bit, and it's only a couple more minutes before the end of the video. So I'm reading from the introduction to one of the editions of Song of Myself, written by Robert Haas, who's a former poet laureate and one of my idols. He's incredible. And he says the argument, and it's a little bit long, so just listen, go with me. The argument that Song of Myself makes, that we have more in common than separates us, that that common thing is the nature that courses through us, that we and the nature of which we are a part are carried by a profoundly sexual rhythm. Urge and urge and urge, he would write, always the procreant urge of the world. That the principle of nature is abundance and variety. That death is as much a part of its rhythm as birth and sexual desire are, that love, which he calls the kelson of creation, and sympathy, I am attesting sympathy, he writes, shall I make my list of things in the house and skip the house that supports them? Are among the deepest ways that the human imagination connects people to one another, and to that larger rhythm, that the body is as important as the soul, that the teeming life of Manhattan and its working people and the immensity and the diversity of the American continent embody this nature, and that it is a great leveler and hence a democratic power, and is the power bound to supersede all previous notions of divinity, and that this is as common as the grass. This argument is made in the ideas of the poem, in its dazzling and superabundant lists, and in its seriousness and humor and tenderness and moments of melodrama and flashes of tragedy, but also in the sheer range of its language. Whitman draws his diction from every level of written and spoken language available to him, the speech of the streets, the blab of the pave, he calls it, an example of what I mean, the speech of the crafts, the languages of the professions, the vocabularies of science and technology and law and the pulpit. This poem about democracy and imagination and what to make of life and death, and about a person's own wondering experience of his own existence, makes its case for our common human imagination by deploying the abundance, variety, and hilarity of the languages in which human beings have both described and invented the world in which they find themselves living. I can never say it better than Bob Haas, so I will leave that there. I will say that we're also looking at this unit a work by Sarah Winnemucca and Harriet Jacobs, because to talk about what is American literature by not looking at those who lived here first and those who were brought here and who have contributed beyond measure to our national understanding of ourselves and to our art is to only look with one eye. And we want to look at with both eyes open at who we've been and who we hope to be. So enjoy Song of Myself. Bye.